Welcome. Have you ever experienced situations where you walk away feeling regret or remorse or disappointment in yourself that you didn't speak up, that you didn't say something, whether it's at work or with your partner? Did you have experiences where you felt emotions and you suppressed them? Most of us at some point have had this experience. But if this is something you're doing on a regular basis, this video is for you. A lot of people look at, unfortunately, this type of behavior as a positive thing, at least on the surface. I'm not being confrontational. I'm choosing a path of least resistance where promoting harmony, reducing conflict, etc. But in effect, what really happens is you're just then either suppressing how you feel or avoiding situations. Typically, I find with families and couples, there's a lot of effort put into avoiding saying and engaging in certain conversations and going in certain areas because it may lead to conflict. But as we know, conflict is healthy if it's done in the right way. This constant sort of avoiding whatever the sort of motivation is not healthy. A lot of people will, there's different reasons for this. Some people are what we would call people pleasers. They don't want to upset people. They want to make people happy. They want to keep people happy, so they don't voice their opinions or say anything that may affect that person's happiness. It's a common term we use, people pleasers. There are other people, as I mentioned earlier, who, through a lot of their conditioning when they were young, especially in their childhood, may feel that conflict is not acceptable, conflict not okay. We have to do everything we can to avoid conflict. I actually had a similar experience myself. When I was young, I was disciplined if I would get upset or raise my voice or get angry. And although my parents didn't, that wasn't their goal, it sort of sent me a message that this is an unacceptable behavior. And so when I was a young adult, and I started having my own intimate relationships, I was an ultimate, as we would say, shutdowner. I would just sense some tension or some increase in the intensity of the conversation, and I would shut down. I've obviously learned to move past that, and I'm much different now. But the point I'm trying to make is there's a lot of different reasons why we get here. Sometimes we can have a kind of volatile partner who is very emotional or is easily upset, and that can lead us over time, sometimes over many years, to just not want to rock the boat, not want to upset them, not want to do or say anything. Now, the problem with all this, and there's many problems I'll go through here, is number one, we're not being authentic, we're not being ourselves. Number two, and not necessarily in this order, but suppressing our feelings, suppressing our desire to say something has very negative consequences for your mental health. Now, number one, suppressing, not saying what's on your mind, not expressing yourself will lead to what we call rumination, which is this sort of repetitive going over this scenario again and again. And especially if you feel you should have said something, you're going to be, next time I see them, I'm going to say this, or I should have spoke up, or I should have, done this, I should have done that. So we're ruminating these thoughts afterwards. And one of the things a lot of people don't realize is if I actually do speak up in the moment, in that situation, tell people how I feel, or what I think, I won't have to the same degree, or maybe at all, this rumination, which is very positive. The other thing is that what we know from research is that, and there's been extensive research been done on this, that people can actually make themselves sick by just suppressing emotion, keeping things buried and stuck inside, and it becomes toxic for them. There's a lot of health consequences associated with this. Certainly, a lot of the couples I work with, a lot of the problem is they're just not communicating. They haven't been communicating for years because either they don't feel they know how, or they feel that every time they do it goes to conflict, so they just end up sort of avoiding these situations, trying to find some sort of common ground where we don't have any conflict. But they're not connected. That's the other issue. As I mentioned earlier about being authentic, people are not connected, especially in intimate relationships, if they're just avoiding anything that may sort of, be sensitive or emotional. You can't connect emotionally when you're censoring most of what you're saying and doing. Of course, explaining it this way makes a lot of sense. But when people are kind of in the moment, and that's the problem, is and that leads us to the question of why does this happen? Well, as I mentioned, there's a number of different reasons, but one of the things I like to do with my clients is I want to slow this right down, and we want to go kind of moment to moment. And what you'll notice is when there's certain cues from the other person, they're getting a bit upset, they're getting a bit, what did you say to me? Or what are you talking about? And then you'll notice that the other person will then, become very aware of this, increase in intensity or energy or whatever you want to call it, and they will then shut down. Now, different people have this to different degrees, and I'm trying to appeal to a very broad audience here. So I'm talking of many variations of how this happens. But this is often how it happens in the moment. And the thing about this video is really that if you're going to change this, and you feel like after listening to this you'd like to change this, then you have to start observing what's going on. You have to become more aware of what's happening to you. Because it could be, like I said earlier, it could be you're a people pleaser. You don't want to upset people. It could be that you have these negative assumptions that somehow if I disagree with someone, they'll be upset with me or I'll offend them or something like that. Maybe that's the reason. Maybe it's just simply that, as I said earlier, you have a partner that's very sensitive, and by not agreeing with them, it leads to some conflict, and you don't want that to happen, which typically most of us don't, although I think we really need to start to understand conflict as a healthy part of communicating with people. We can't continue to be connected to people if we constantly avoid things that are uncomfortable. We can't approach sensitive topics. We can't really be really ourselves and be connected if we're doing that. And to be honest, my theory on a lot of this is when I look at relationships, and I look at families, and I look at friendships, which I do in my practice all the time with clients, there's often a pattern of something taking place and something not being addressed, and people don't want to say anything, but then what happens is there starts to become this avoidance. They start avoiding them, start talking to them less, they start not returning their calls or texts. Next thing, a year or two from now, or maybe last time, they're barely communicating. And if you go backwards and look to the beginning, maybe it started with somebody just not feeling comfortable expressing themselves or saying I didn't appreciate when that happened, and then stuffing those feelings, which is the term I prefer to suppression. It's just, I think it's has more oomph to it. They're stuffing those feelings and they're churning inside and becoming toxic. And then when a person tries to call or reach out or ask you to meet them for lunch or whatever it is, you've still got all that negative emotion inside, which could have been resolved. You've said, hey, when you showed up a half an hour late and didn't say anything, I felt that was rude. I felt that was inconsiderate. However, you don't have to use harsh terms like that, or direct terms like that. You could use softer terms, but nonetheless, having a dialogue about something happening that I don't like. As I said, for my years of working with people in relationships and workplace issues, stuff like that, a lot of it can be traced back to an awkward situation people didn't talk about, they just avoided, and it just became this kind of mess that over through avoidance became bigger and bigger. We don't want to do that. That's not a healthy thing to do. One of the other things to be aware of is avoidance is something that is also associated with this. The moment-to-moment sort of situation in terms of what's happening is a little different. I may be, it's similar to procrastination, saying, oh, I'm going to do it tomorrow, I'm doing it next week. People with anxiety will avoid things because they're going to maybe make them more anxious. There's a situation going to a gathering of people, they feel maybe difficult for them, so they don't go. So that's more of avoidance. So there's suppressing feelings and thoughts, and also avoiding. Avoiding is very common if you've had any history of trauma. It's the number one thing we see is avoidance, because there's this huge area of incredibly painful stuff that you don't want to go to. And if you think that anything you're doing is going to, bring that to the surface, you'll probably avoid that. And I have a lot of people who avoid coming to therapy because of that. They make appointments but don't show because the idea of uncovering that and looking at that is pretty overwhelming for them. And I don't not understand working with these people, I know how difficult this can be. But it's not that we're not understanding why people are doing these things. As I've said in my last video, a lot of what's happening here and can be all summed up in people just being in these automatic patterns. They're not aware. They're just doing things, and then maybe later on being regretful or saying, oh God, I shouldn't have handled that way. The problem is this lack of awareness, giving into these automatic patterns. And for some of us who were like myself, a bit older, we may have had these patterns since we were like kids. It's not something you're necessarily that aware of. It seems to be more like how you are in a sense, but it doesn't have to be. We've got suppression, we've got avoidance, we've got like the term I like, which is stuffing. Now, one thing a lot of people don't realize, and is very common, is when I work with anger, which is one of the areas that I'm focused a lot on, we can identify for a lot of people that a lot of the anger is rooted in, anger issues are rooted in having things happen you don't like, and then stuffing them, suppressing them until it builds so much that you explode. And unfortunately, what happens is that you typically explode not on the person that sort of initially started this, or the person that may have upset you or something. You would often explode on the person that's maybe your kids or your partner or your dog or somebody who would be considered from a psychological position an easier target. We see this all the time with people with their work-related issues, where their boss may, kind of be critical of them and maybe raise their voice or something like that, and they, instead of standing up for themselves, they'll go home and take it out on their partner or their kids or something, because they're from a psychological position. Less threatening targets. Now, I know people don't think in those terms, but that's kind of what's happening. So we want to be very aware of this. There's a lot of consequences to this type of behavior if we don't check it. So now, in the last video, I talked a little bit about stress and how to alleviate stress, reduce the stress in your body, and I'm not going to necessarily go over all that again, but I wanted to address this to the person who is avoiding, stuffing, not speaking their mind, not saying what they want to say, and unfortunately spending a lot of time ruminating, which people may not be aware, but rumination, this repetitive thought, like going over situations and appraising yourself in a negative way, generates a lot of, can lead to depression. It's a common symptom of depression. People ruminate a lot. Look at the past, look at the decisions they've made, actions they've taken. Now, I'm focusing mostly on just thoughts and feelings and stuffing them, but I just wanted to point out how, in a sense, destructive rumination can be. And if there's a way to reduce it, which there is, then why not choose that path? Now, we're going to get to the next bit, which is like, I understand all of it, what you're kind of presenting here in this video, but what do I do about it? How do I change it? I've been this way for years and years. What do I do? Well, it's actually very simple in a sense. It's not easy, but it's very simple. We have to start changing the patterns. The number one thing is become aware. Start to notice when you're doing it. If you're walking away from this video and want to make a change, that's the first thing you do. Start to notice what happens when you're in conversations with people, when you're talking to your partner and you have a thought or you want to express yourself or something's going on and you don't, and you stuff it. Start to become aware of that, aware when that's happening, and start to just notice that more and more. Then what I want you to do, and this is the trickier part, is I want you to start to change it. Now, typically when I work with people, many people in these situations get very overwhelmed, and that's why they shut down and why they're overwhelmed and why they don't communicate and etc. So I get that. The thing that we want to do then is, if we're going to change the pattern, I like to use the term that we want to find people that are safe or easier to start to change the pattern with. Now, a lot of people, quite honestly, will go out with friends and they want to pick a movie and they won't even express what movie they want to see because they just want to go along with what everybody else wants. But those are opportunities that are very safe, where people could say, hey, I'd like to see the new Top Gun movie. And when you're starting to change it, think of situations or people that are not strangers, but you're going to have, they're fairly safe people, they're people you're comfortable with, and you can start to change the pattern with them. Now, there's people like very close to you, you could even mention that, hey, I want to start to do this. Typically, when I work with families and work with couples, a lot of the complaints I'll get from the person who's more communicative is that their partner is like, doesn't say much, doesn't express themselves, is often just kind of like, you know, how was work? Fine. They're not really engaging. So they're kind of missing a lot of connection and engagement with this person. We want to change that. So if you're sharing this with people, they typically are going to be great. I want to talk more. I want to communicate more. I want to be more connected and more engaged. I want to not just avoid things. I want to. I remember when I was quite young and I had this pattern. I was like 20 or something. I had a girlfriend that was very upset about the fact that I would not communicate with her, but she would get so upset and so intense I would just shut down. And at the time I didn't know what was going on. I just couldn't, for some reason, speak to her. Now, for certain situations, of course, like if you may need professional help with this, but I'm sort of putting this out there as sort of information. You can try this on your own. Certainly if you try it and you can't do it, if it's just too overwhelming and too difficult, then there's always an option for professional help. But try to do these sort of baby steps with this, you know, start to identify where you're not speaking your mind, you're not expressing yourself, where you're, you know, not sharing your emotions, and start to slowly change that. And it doesn't have to be too great a change. It can be just a slow baby step, gradual, because what will happen is as you do it more, you'll say, oh, this is working. And you'll also start to realize the main problem is that people have negative assumptions. That's the reason they do it in the first place, typically. They have negative assumptions about speaking their mind, speaking either what thoughts or emotions or experiences they have, because if they didn't have that, they wouldn't be reluctant to share. You're either feeling you're going to upset the person, it's going to lead to conflict, it's going to cause problems, etc. And so when you start to share and you start to do that, the great thing that happens is your brain, you start to realize, well, it went pretty well and it's going good, and I tried it again and that was felt better, went better. You start to then over time rewire your brain to a new way of looking at this. A lot of the clients that I work with in couples, when we first meet, one of them will be very sort of like shutting down in communication, not sharing, just avoiding the person, hoping that whatever the disagreement will just like dissipate and be gone in a couple days. Over time, through working together and seeing the value of communicating and expressing yourself, they actually change that. So they're actually looking forward to, hey, let's sit down and talk about this. Let's go over this situation that happened and let's try to resolve it. And so anyone at any point can start to make this change, just a matter of making a choice to do so. Now, as I said, the awareness piece comes first. Now, if you're listening to this video and finding it helpful, typically you're identifying with what I'm talking about. But you need to get the awareness first, because once the awareness, the change can't happen, until the awareness takes place. Until you really start to notice, start observing, wow, like I was gonna say something to my boss and I just I waited and just swallowed it, and then you start to notice, and you may not know all the reasons why you're doing it, but you're starting to see that. The other thing I like people to start to do, and this is really helpful, because it's an automatic pattern typically and it's outside of awareness, it just kind of happens. I think you have to make clearly a plan sometimes to go and say certain things or speak up in a meeting or something like that. You have to kind of make a plan. This week I'm going to try to do this. I'm going to share with my partner what's on my mind, or I'm going to speak up in those work meetings where I never say anything. You have to make a bit of a plan, I think, to hold yourself accountable to make that change. I think it's sometimes challenging if you aren't specific in that way, because then it's a matter of, this week I'm going to do this, and then it's very easy to say, I'll do it tomorrow, do it tomorrow. and try to hold yourself a bit accountable. That's going to be the key. Now, take this slow, and we certainly don't want people to become overwhelmed. Take it slow and just gradually move in that direction. Any kind of move in that direction will be positive, and you don't have to change the entire pattern overnight, of course. Typically the reason you're probably doing it is because it's going to overwhelm you, or it's going to feel overwhelming. So we don't need to push people to that point. What's going to happen if you do this? What are the sort of benefits of this? Well, it's very healthy, as I mentioned earlier, to be expressing yourself. You'll probably find that your relationships will benefit. You will be better connected to people because they'll have more of awareness of what's going on with you. You'll start to rewire your brain that communication and speaking your mind is healthy. You'll ideally start to be more aware of personal boundaries too, and start to express when something, you're not okay with something, you don't want to do something. One of the things that typically happens with people who don't have good personal boundaries is they will agree to things because they don't want to upset the person, and then they end up angry at the person because they're having to do something they don't want to do, when in fact they're really actually angry at themselves because they didn't stand up and say, look, I don't want to do this thing. Years ago, I used to have a lot of people ask me to help them move. I think because I was probably, when I was a bit younger, I worked out a lot, and they would think, oh, Jim can help us move. And when I was around 40, I made a decision that I'm not going to be moving people and potentially injure myself. So I just made a deal with myself that I'm not moving anyone. And I just would tell everybody who would ask me, sorry, I'm no longer, at this age, no longer moving people. And everybody was fine with it, but it was something that I decided, and then it became a personal boundary, and nobody got upset with me. But so that's an example of where you can eventually go with this, where you're starting to share yourself more, you're starting to express what you need, express what you want. People can sort of really get to know who you are to a greater degree. You're not then ruminating afterwards and going over things in your mind while you're sitting watching television. I should have said this, I should have done that, I should have spoke up. There's tremendous benefits here. It's very healthy for you in terms of you're not spending all that energy suppressing or avoiding, and especially suppressing emotion and stuff like that. It just can become toxic inside of you, and it's really not healthy at all. I hope that's helpful. Certainly I welcome any messages from you or comments, or if there's anything you don't understand, please message me. I got a lot of people that reached out after the last video, very positive, appreciative comments, and I love to hear that. I'm just trying to, as I said, I think last time, reach a broader audience. If this is relevant to you and it's helpful, I'm happy. If it's not, then in future videos maybe. So take care.